This book may look like nothing more than an old religious manuscript, but it's not what you think. The Tibetan Book of the Dead doesn't just talk about death, it dares to describe what happens in the exact moments after your final breath. For most of us, death is the greatest mystery. We spend our lives trying not to think about it, hoping that it's far away, and yet deep down, we all know. It is the one experience every living being must face. Science can tell us when the body shuts down, medicine can describe the fading of the brain, but the Book of the Dead asks a question that goes far deeper. What happens to consciousness when the body is gone? According to this ancient text, consciousness doesn't simply vanish. It enters a passageway. It drifts into visions, sounds, and landscapes that feel more vivid than anything you've ever seen in life. And those visions aren't random. They are a map of the afterlife, filled with guardians, traps, and doors that either lead to freedom or lock you back into another lifetime. For more than 1,000 years, Tibetan monks have gathered around the dying, reciting the words of this book. Imagine the scene: a cold Himalayan night, incense burning, prayer wheels spinning slowly, and a lama chanting from the Bardo Thodol while a body lies still before him. To the monks, death was not the end, it was a journey. And the words of this book were like a lantern carried through absolute darkness. But here is the real twist. The book insists that everything encountered in the afterlife, the gods, the demons, the visions of light, are not external beings. They are mirrors of the mind itself. In other words, when you die, you don't just meet otherworldly creatures. You meet yourself in the most terrifying and magnificent forms you could imagine. And before we dive into what that means, let me ask you something. Where in the world are you watching Sigil Sanctum from? Write it down in the comments, because right now, across thousands of miles, people are gathering here with the same question that haunted the ancients. What happens when we die? Now here's why this matters. Because if the Tibetan Book of the Dead is right, then death is not the end. It's a test, and the outcome of that test depends on recognition. The text says that in the moment of dying, the soul sees the clear light, pure, boundless awareness. If you can recognize it as your true nature, you are instantly free. No more rebirth, no more suffering, liberation. But if you don't recognize it, if you turn away in fear or confusion, the journey begins to twist. Peaceful visions arrive, but if you don't see them as illusions, they transform into wrathful gods, into terrifying monsters. You run, you hide, and in the end, you are dragged back into the cycle of life, only to repeat the same struggles again. Think about that for a moment. According to this text, you have faced death not once, but countless times. Each time you had a chance to break free. And each time, failing to recognize the truth meant you were reborn, with no memory of the lives before. The wheel of existence turns endlessly, grinding on through birth, suffering, and death. And unless you awaken, you are caught in it forever. This is the real danger, not death itself, but ignorance. The book suggests that most souls never realize they have a choice. They are overwhelmed by visions, blinded by fear, and pulled helplessly into another body. If this text had never been written, if it had never been passed down through generations of monks, we might have lost one of the only detailed maps of the afterlife. To the Tibetans, it is not simply a scripture, it is a survival guide for the soul. And let me pause here for a moment. If you feel drawn to uncovering hidden knowledge like this, knowledge that sits at the crossroads of history, myth, and spirituality, make sure you subscribe to Sigil Sanctum. Because here, we don't just scratch the surface, we go into the depths, the places where science, religion, and philosophy overlap, and we bring back the truths most people never dare to look at. So here's the question the Book of the Dead forces us to ask. If death is not the end, then what is it? A passage? A trap? A mirror? And what happens if you fail the test? To understand the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or Bardo Thodol as it's called in Tibet, we first need to understand the world that gave birth to it.
The text is believed to have been composed in the 8th century by Padmasambhava, a figure so legendary in Tibet that he is often called the second Buddha. Padmasambhava was not just a teacher. He was a magician, a yogi, and a mystic who blended Indian Buddhism with the older shamanic traditions of Tibet. When he came to Tibet, Buddhism was still new, competing with ancient practices of sky gods, mountain spirits, and burial rituals. To win the hearts of the people, Padmasambhava didn't erase these old traditions. He absorbed them, transforming local spirits into Buddhist protectors and reshaping shamanic death rites into a new spiritual science. Out of this fusion, the Bardo Thodol was born. According to Tibetan lore, Padmasambhava didn't openly teach this text to the public. Instead, he dictated it to his consort, Yeshe Tsogyal, one of Tibet's most revered female practitioners. She recorded his words and then, in true mystical fashion, hid the manuscript in a cave, a stupa, or perhaps even in the mind of a future disciple. In Tibetan tradition, such hidden texts are called terma, or treasures. They are not lost. They are concealed on purpose, to be revealed at a time when the world is ready. Centuries later, in the 14th century, the great Turton, or treasure revealer, Karma Lingpa, claimed to have discovered the Bardo Thodol. Imagine the scene. A rugged Himalayan mountainside, caves tucked into icy cliffs, and a monk deep in meditation suddenly finding himself compelled to uncover a hidden manuscript sealed away for generations. To Tibetans, this wasn't coincidence. It was destiny. The book had been waiting for the right time to emerge, and that time was now. What makes this text different from almost every other sacred scripture is its purpose. Most holy books are written for the living, to guide behavior, ethics, and rituals during life. The Bardo Thodol is different. It is written for the dead. The very name means liberation through hearing in the intermediate state. Its purpose is not to teach philosophy, but to be read aloud to someone who is dying or has just died. The belief is that the consciousness, even after leaving the body, can still hear. And so the lama, the monk, or the family member chants the words into the ear of the departed, guiding the soul through the perilous landscapes it will soon encounter. Think about the intimacy of this practice. A loved one has just passed away. Their body lies still, but their soul, according to Tibetan Buddhism, is still near, confused and disoriented. In that moment, the living gather around and read aloud. O child of Buddha nature, now you are experiencing the radiant light of pure reality. Recognize it. This is your true mind. These are not poems or prayers of comfort. They are instructions, precise, urgent, and practical. To the Tibetans, death was not a mystery left to chance. It was a journey to be navigated, and the Bardo Thodol was the map. But why Tibet? Why did such a text appear there and not somewhere else? Part of the answer lies in Tibetan culture itself. Tibetans lived close to death. In the high mountains, life was fragile. Harsh winters, thin air, and limited farmland meant that death was never far away. They also practiced unique death rituals, such as sky burials, where bodies are left on mountaintops to be consumed by vultures. To the Tibetans, this wasn't morbid. It was natural. The body returned to the sky, and the soul continued its journey. In such a world, a detailed guide to the afterlife made sense. The text itself doesn't read like a philosophical essay. It reads like a travel guide. Each page addresses the dead directly, in the second person. O noble one, it begins, listen without distraction. You are now experiencing the Bardo. Do not be afraid. It tells the soul what to expect, what it will see, and how it must respond. It is urgent, repetitive, and rhythmic, because it is meant to be heard in a state of confusion, where clarity is rare. And unlike many religions, which insist that salvation comes only through faith in a god, the Bardo Thodol is brutally honest. No one is coming to save you. Not Buddha, not the gods, not the lamas. Liberation comes only through recognition. You must recognize the visions of the Bardo as projections of your own mind. If you do, you are free. If you don't, you are trapped again in the cycle of rebirth. The responsibility is yours. This origin story also tells us something about how Tibetans saw wisdom. For them, sacred knowledge was not static. It was alive. A text could be hidden for centuries, only to reappear when needed. A teaching could be discovered not in libraries, but in visions and caves. The Bardo Thodol was one of these treasures. To Western scholars, this might sound like myth, but to Tibetans, it was proof that the universe itself protects wisdom until humanity is ready to hear it.
By the time the Book of the Dead spread beyond Tibet, it astonished outsiders. In the early 20th century, the text was translated into English by Walter Evans Wentz, who gave it the dramatic name The Tibetan Book of the Dead, echoing the more familiar Egyptian Book of the Dead. Suddenly, the West was confronted with a scripture that claimed to map the afterlife in detail. Psychologists, philosophers, and even occultists were fascinated. Carl Jung wrote about it. Later, Timothy Leary used it as the basis for the psychedelic experience, arguing that the stages of the Bardo mirrored the stages of an LSD trip. But before all of this Western fascination, before the translations and the pop culture references, the Bardo Thodol was something much simpler and much more human. It was the voice of a monk leaning close to the ear of a dying person, whispering, "Do not be afraid. What you are seeing is your own mind. Recognize it, and you will be free." The Bardo Thodol tells us that when a person dies, their consciousness does not disappear instantly. Instead, it moves through a sequence of stages, 3 great passages called the Bardos. The word Bardo itself simply means in-between state, and according to Tibetan Buddhism, there are 6 Bardos in total. 3 of them happen during life, in waking, in dreaming, and in deep meditation. But the other 3 unfold only in death. And it is these 3 that the Book of the Dead describes in extraordinary detail. The very first stage comes at the instant when life leaves the body. The Book of the Dead describes this as the Chikai Bardo, the Bardo of the moment of death. Imagine this: the last breath leaves your lungs, the sounds of the world fade, the body begins to feel like an empty shell, but the mind, the awareness that is looking through your eyes right now, is still awake. At this exact moment, the book says, something astonishing happens. You are bathed in the clear light of ultimate reality. This is not a light like sunlight or firelight. It is described as dazzling, limitless, beyond form, a radiance that is both terrifying and blissful. In Tibetan tradition, this is the moment when the true nature of mind reveals itself. If you can recognize it, liberation is immediate. The soul dissolves into that light and there is no rebirth. But here is the tragedy. Most of us do not recognize it. The light is too pure, too overwhelming. It feels like annihilation. Instead of merging, the soul turns away. Confused, unprepared, it misses its one great chance. And so the journey continues. Tibetan lamas believe that advanced meditators, monks who have trained for years in recognizing the nature of mind, can seize this moment. They recognize the light not as something external, but as their own consciousness. But for the average person, the shock of death is too great. We cling, we resist, and the door to liberation slips shut. The soul then enters the Chonyid Bardo, the Bardo of experiencing reality. This is where things become strange, vivid, and terrifying. The text says that the dead will encounter visions of deities. At first, they appear as peaceful gods, radiant Buddhas surrounded by light, colors more brilliant than anything on earth, sounds of celestial music. These figures represent wisdom, compassion, and the higher qualities of mind. The book urges the soul, do not be afraid, recognize them. They are projections of your own nature. But again, most people fail. The peaceful visions are too intense, too alien. The soul cannot accept that these luminous beings are its own creation. Fear takes over. And when fear arises, the peaceful visions transform. They become wrathful deities. The Bardo Thodol describes them in terrifying detail. Monstrous figures with flames for hair, fangs dripping with blood, eyes like burning coals, and weapons in their hands. They roar, they chase, they terrify the wandering soul. To the unprepared, this feels like punishment, like judgment. But the text insists, these demons are not real. They are the shadows of your own mind, your unacknowledged fears, your suppressed desires, the violence and confusion you carried through life. This is one of the most radical teachings of the book. Heaven and hell are not places, they are states of mind. What you experience in death is not handed down by a god, it is a mirror of your own consciousness. The light and the monsters are both you. Here the instructions become urgent. The text tells the soul, do not fear the wrathful deities, recognize them as your own mind, they cannot harm you. But again, recognition is rare. Most souls panic. They flee the visions, not realizing that by running from them, they give them power. This stage can last for days, with wave after wave of visions, peaceful gods, wrathful gods, sounds of thunder, blinding lights, terrifying landscapes. The soul is tossed like a boat in a storm, and yet, at every moment, liberation is still possible. If the soul can simply recognize, this is illusion, this is my own mind, then freedom opens instantly. Finally, if the soul fails to recognize both the clear light and the visions, it enters the Sidpa Bardo, the Bardo of becoming. At this stage, the soul feels pulled back toward physical existence. It is restless, searching, caught between terror and desire. The Book of the Dead describes how the consciousness sees scenes of people embracing, visions of mothers and fathers, flashes of intimacy. These are not random images, they are doorways into new lives. The pull of karma, the energy of past actions, draws the soul toward rebirth. The text even gives bizarre and vivid warnings. It tells the soul not to enter a womb in ignorance, not to be seduced by the visions of parents, because this is how rebirth happens. Unless liberation is achieved, the soul is helplessly sucked into a new body, forgetting everything that came before. A new life begins, and the cycle repeats. This is the ultimate teaching of the Bardo Thodol. Death is not the end. It is a passage, and unless you awaken, you will return again and again, endlessly cycling through birth, suffering, and death. For Tibetans, these stages were not abstract philosophy, they were practical instructions. But for modern readers, the Bardos can also be seen as a profound psychology of dying. The clear light could be understood as the moment when the ego dissolves and consciousness experiences pure awareness, something meditators sometimes glimpse in deep practice. The visions of peaceful and wrathful deities mirror the subconscious, the hidden parts of the mind rising up when the rational brain shuts down. And the pull toward rebirth can be compared to the deep instinct for survival, the attachment to life that even death cannot erase. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, wrote that the Book of the Dead was not only a guide for the dying, but also a guide for the living. He believed that the gods and demons of the Bardo were archetypes of the human psyche. In facing them, we learn something about the fears and desires we carry even now in life. What makes the Bardo Thodol even more fascinating is how it resonates with other cultures. In ancient Egypt, the Book of the Dead described the soul's journey after death, facing gods and tests, and being judged in the hall of Ma'at. In Christianity, the afterlife is filled with angels and demons, heaven and hell. In Hinduism, the soul passes through stages before rebirth. But the Tibetan text is unique because it strips away external judgment. It does not say that God condemns you. It says that you condemn yourself through ignorance. And it does not say salvation comes through faith alone. It says salvation comes through recognition, seeing clearly in the most terrifying moment that all of it is illusion, the human element. But perhaps the most moving part of the Book of the Dead is not its cosmic visions, but its humanity. Imagine being read to after your death, your loved ones whispering guidance to you as your soul drifts in confusion. The book becomes a bridge between the living and the dead, a final act of love. It is a reminder that death is not just a personal event, but a shared journey. The living help the dead, and the dead, through their journey, remind the living of what truly matters: awareness, compassion, and liberation. The Bardo Thodol is not just a literal map of the afterlife. For centuries, Tibetan masters have taught that its verses are written in layers, like a code. On the surface, it guides the dying through visions and trials, but beneath that surface lies something more radical, a teaching meant for the living. To truly understand this, we have to ask, what if the Bardos are not only states after death, but also metaphors for our daily lives? The Bardos as states of consciousness. Tibetan masters often remind their students that you don't need to wait until death to enter the Bardos. Every night when you dream, you are already in a Bardo. Every time you meditate deeply, slipping past the chatter of the mind, you are in a Bardo. Even moments of crisis, shock, or deep transformation are Bardo-like states, times when the ground beneath your identity shifts. From this perspective, the clear light of the first Bardo isn't only about dying, it is about those rare flashes in life when we glimpse something beyond ourselves. In meditation, in awe, even in near-death experiences, the visions of gods and demons aren't only for the dead, they are the projections we face every day. Our hopes, our fears, our desires, our guilt. Death simply magnifies them. Seen this way, the Book of the Dead becomes more than a funeral text. It becomes a manual for waking up in life. If you can learn to recognize your projections while alive, then at death, the task becomes easier. The wrathful deities as mirrors. One of the most misunderstood parts of the book is the terrifying description of wrathful deities. To Western readers, they sound like demons, like something from a nightmare. But Tibetan teachers insist, these are not external forces, they are mirrors. Each wrathful deity is associated with a specific human flaw: anger, attachment, pride, ignorance, jealousy. In life, we suppress these emotions, bury them deep in the subconscious. But in death, with no body to distract us, they surge up in full force, appearing as monstrous gods. The teaching here is subtle but powerful. If you can face your demons now, if you can look at your anger, your fear, your jealousy and recognize them as passing states of mind, then you won't be terrified when they appear in the Bardo. In this way, the Book of the Dead is not about scaring us, it is about training us. Hidden Tantric Symbolism. The Bardo Thodol also contains a hidden tantric layer. In Vajrayana Buddhism, which is practiced in Tibet, the entire universe is seen as the play of energy, masculine and feminine, light and dark, creation and destruction. The peaceful and wrathful deities can be understood in this light. The peaceful ones represent openness, wisdom, and compassion. The wrathful ones represent fierce energy, the raw power needed to cut through illusion. Together, they form a balance. In Tibetan art, you'll often see terrifying figures locked in embrace with beautiful goddesses. To the uninitiated, this looks shocking, but it symbolizes the union of opposites, the truth that liberation comes not by rejecting one side, but by embracing both. Some Tibetan teachers even hint that the descriptions of entering wombs in the third Bardo are not just about reincarnation, but also about the union of energies in tantric practice. The imagery is deliberately provocative, forcing the reader to see past the literal and into the symbolic. The journey as a mirror of life. If we step back, the entire journey through the Bardos can be seen as a mirror of life itself. The first Bardo, with its blinding clear light, mirrors the moment of birth, the shock of entering awareness, too bright to comprehend. The second Bardo, with its visions of gods and demons, mirrors the struggles of life, constantly pulled between joy and suffering, hope and fear. The third Bardo, with its pull toward rebirth, mirrors our attachments, the desires that keep us returning to the same patterns again and again. In this sense, the Book of the Dead is telling us, you are already in the Bardo, right now. This life itself is an in-between state. Learn here, awaken here, and you won't be lost there. Mystical parallels around the world. This esoteric reading also explains why the book resonates far beyond Tibet. Many cultures, when stripped to their mystical core, describe something similar. In Hinduism, the Upanishads speak of the self, the Atman, which is identical to the ultimate reality, Brahman. Recognition of this truth leads to liberation. Doesn't that sound like the clear light? In Christian mysticism, saints like Meister Eckhart wrote about the divine darkness, an overwhelming encounter with God that annihilates the self. Again, the same paradox. Salvation lies in surrender. In Greek philosophy, Plato described learning as a form of remembering, and death as the soul's return to truth. The cave allegory, mistaking shadows for reality, echoes the Tibetan warning not to mistake the visions of the Bardo for real beings. In Sufi mysticism, poets like Rumi and Ibn Arabi wrote that heaven and hell are within us, reflections of the heart's condition, a line of thought nearly identical to the Tibetan claim that the Bardo visions are projections of our own mind. These parallels suggest something profound. Across cultures, mystics have been pointing to the same inner landscape, though using different symbols. Modern esoteric interpretations. In modern times, the Tibetan Book of the Dead has also been embraced by those exploring altered states of consciousness. In the 1960s, Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, later Ram Dass, and Ralph Metzner published The Psychedelic Experience, which used the structure of the Bardos as a guide for LSD trips. They believed that psychedelic states mirrored death, ego dissolution, visions of light, encounters with archetypal figures, and the return to ordinary reality. Whether or not one agrees with this use, it shows how the text continues to inspire seekers looking for maps of the inner mind. The Bardos become not only passages after death, but gateways into the psyche. The hidden message. At the deepest level, the esoteric teaching of the Bardo Thodol may be this. Death is not an enemy, it is a teacher. Every fearsome vision, every dazzling light, every pull toward rebirth is a lesson in disguise. The question is not, what will happen when I die, but rather, can I recognize my own mind, right now, in this moment? The book whispers that liberation is never far away. It does not come from outside, it comes from seeing clearly, and that clarity can dawn in death, in meditation, in dreams, or in the middle of ordinary life. Modern relevance. Even though the Bardo Thodol was written more than 700 years ago, its influence stretches into the present in surprising ways. What began as a funerary guide whispered to the dying in remote Himalayan monasteries has now become a global text studied by psychologists, philosophers, and seekers from every background. Jung and psychology. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung was one of the first Western thinkers to engage deeply with the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Jung believed the visions of peaceful and wrathful deities were not supernatural beings, but archetypes of the human mind, universal symbols that emerge from the collective unconscious. When the book describes a wrathful deity with fire in its hair and blood dripping from its fangs, Jung saw it as the embodiment of human rage, fear, or repressed instincts. In this way, the Bardo Thodol anticipated modern psychology. It taught that the horrors we face after death are really the shadows of our own minds. This interpretation makes the text relevant to therapy even today. Think of it like this: the demons you run from in dreams, the anxieties that haunt you in daily life, they are your bardos right now. To face them without fear, to recognize them as part of yourself, is to gain freedom. Near-death experiences. Another modern link comes from the growing research into near-death experiences. Across cultures, people who have been clinically dead for a short time and then revived describe remarkably similar patterns: moving through a tunnel, encountering a bright light, meeting spiritual beings, feeling their lives reviewed, and sometimes being told it is not their time. The parallels to the Bardo Thodol are striking. The clear light, the encounter with radiant figures, the overwhelming visions, all appear in these testimonies. Scientists debate the cause. Are they the brain's final bursts of activity, or glimpses into something beyond? The Book of the Dead doesn't answer the question scientifically, but it provides a framework, a story that makes sense of these experiences, a reminder that death might not be an end, but a passage. Timothy Leary and the Counterculture. In the 1960s, the book found new life in an unexpected place: the psychedelic counterculture. Harvard psychologist Timothy Leary, along with Richard Alpert, who later became Ram Dass, and Ralph Metzner, published The Psychedelic Experience. Their text was openly based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. They argued that taking LSD mirrored the death process. The ego dissolves, visions appear, and then the self is reborn. They used the structure of the Bardos as a guide for navigating these altered states of consciousness. Whether one agrees with their approach or not, this moment shows just how far the reach of the Tibetan text extended, from monastery rituals to the heart of the 20th century cultural revolution. Mindfulness and modern spirituality. Today, the influence of the Bardo Thodol can be felt in the global mindfulness movement. The core teaching, that freedom comes from recognizing thoughts and emotions as passing projections of the mind, lies at the heart of mindfulness meditation. Every time someone pauses to observe their breath, to notice a thought without judgment, they are practicing the same skill that the Book of the Dead urges for the dying soul, the skill of recognition. In this way, the text isn't only about preparing for death, it's about learning to live with awareness. Death becomes the ultimate teacher, reminding us that every moment is fleeting and every state of mind is just another bardo to awaken within. Conclusion. Death as a teacher. So what does the Tibetan Book of the Dead ultimately say about dying? That the journey after death is not ruled by gods, nor by chance, but by the quality of our own mind. At the moment of death, we may encounter the dazzling clear light. If we can recognize it, liberation is instant. If not, we fall into visions, peaceful and terrifying, all reflections of ourselves. And if we still fail to awaken, we are drawn back into the cycle of rebirth. But this teaching is not meant to frighten, it is meant to prepare us. It says, practice now, see through illusion now. Recognize your fears, your anger, your desires as passing clouds of the mind. If you can do this in life, you will not be lost in death. And perhaps that is the most radical lesson of all, that death is not the opposite of life. Death is part of life. To understand dying is to understand living. To face death without fear is to live more fully, with clarity and compassion. The Tibetans whisper to the dying, not because death is terrifying, but because it is a sacred threshold, and the book whispers to us, the living too. Wake up. You are already in the Bardo. Every moment is a chance to awaken. If this journey into the Tibetan Book of the Dead made you think differently about life and death, then you've already glimpsed its power. It is not just a guide for the end, it is a mirror for the present. Tell me in the comments, what do you think happens after death? Your perspective might help others see this mystery in a new light. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden wisdom of ancient texts, myths, and esoteric teachings, make sure you subscribe to Sigil Sanctum, so you won't miss the next dive into the mysteries of the unseen.